Hello. So great to be here, especially with my good friend and colleague, Beverly Glazer, and my new friend and colleague, Diane. I can't pronounce your last name as well as you can, so I don't want to do anything that won't help yourself. With that said, uh, chat's wide open. We depend on chat to make us as relevant as possible, as well as direct our thoughts and ideas to provide some really great takeaways for you this morning. With that said, the word of the day is story. Diane is just famous for storytelling. And because of that, me and Beverly and Diane agreed on story. With that said, like I say, chat's open. We welcome your comments. Look forward to hearing from you today. And right now, I'll turn it over to Beverly, and Beverly can kind of give us an update and her first thoughts on story.
My first thoughts on story. Wow. Okay. The first thought is everybody has a story. And that's what we all have to understand and see. And that we are not boring because of our stories. And often we take ourselves for granted. And you say, oh, yes, I just went to school, got a job. My life is pretty dull. Um, when you really think about it, nobody's life is dull. And we have to understand that the stories that we tell ourselves end up being who we are. And for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Beverly Glazer, and I'm a personal coach and therapist, as well as consultant, and have all that life and work experience. And so, what I really do is help others overcome their stories on many, many levels. So, I work with some very powerful people, and you can say, well, they're all terrific, right? Well, yes, they are. But do they believe they are? That's their story. Okay. And only you know your story. So when we talk about that with Diane Wyzga, who is a wonderful storyteller who has many stories of her own as well, you're going to understand that your story makes you special. And even if you say it's embarrassing, it's horrible, I've gone through so much, that journey has made you powerful. And so, what I do with my clients is I literally uplift them when they say, oh, it's really a bad day, but they're uplifting themselves. Because is it a bad day? Is it a bad minute? Are you thinking way too far ahead, telling your story that perhaps, if I don't do this minute, my entire company or my empire is going to go bankrupt? We tell these crazy stories to ourselves. And so, and we build anxiety, we build tension, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I welcome all your comments, all your suggestions. And you may also be thinking, well, story, what is this really about? It's a difficult word to even suggest. I'm not a writer. I don't have a story. Why am I, why this word? Okay, why this word? Well, what we're getting into today is yes, you can be a writer, but you do not have to be a writer because we always write our own stories in our head all the time. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm this, I'm that, you name it. It's a story. It is not true. So with that, let's pass it to Diane Wyzga, who is the master of story. Hi, Diane.
Uh, thank you, Beverly and Don, for the opportunity to share the mic with you today. We have a lovely 60-degree day out there in the cloudy Pacific Northwest. I will start by introducing myself through the back door. Some of you know me already from Stories from Women Who Walk, which is my podcast, or also here on LinkedIn. but I like to say that I'm an adventuring, mountain climbing, backpacking, country trekking, kayaking, book reading, gardening, bread baking, beekeeping woman who walked 500 miles across Spain on the Camino de Santiago. And there are three values that are key to me in my life, and that is justice, communication, and adventure. And there's a reason why I'm bringing that up. Today, I'm the principal guide and story consultant at Quarter Moon Story Arts. And so I help women become successful origin story creators, sharing the story of how they got from there to here. And with that, they engage and they connect and they influence their communities, their audiences to action. And this work that they do helps them clarify their ideas, their messages, and more importantly than that, use their voices. Because in my world, our voice is our power. And I want to add to the conversation about story because it's it can be so many things. It can be so many things. It can be like the facets in a diamond. But I like to start simply and say that a story is this: something was, something happened, something is. That's all. Something was, something happened, something is. And you can look at any book that you're reading, any movie that you're watching, any song that you're listening to. And that's all it is. Something was, something happened, something is. And so when we're talking about our own stories, we can start with the something small and build it from there. And that's where we get our courage and our confidence from. Instead of looking at something really big and saying, oh my God, I can't write War and Peace. Well, no, I can't either. But if we start with something that is manageable and say, all right, let me take an aspect of my life that I like. I love talking about the Camino pilgrimage. Now, come on over, sit on my front porch with me, and we'll just talk for days and days about the Camino. But again, that story is about something was, I had this idea, something happened, I walked on the Camino, something is, I'm a changed woman from that point on. So that's what I'll throw into the story circle to keep the conversation going.
Well, that's great, Diane. And it's so nice to see how simple it can be
Mhm.
in creating a story. And also, I've always believed everybody hears your music before they appreciate your words. So a lot of storytelling is, how is your attitude? How enthusiastic are you? Are you entertaining? Are you inspiring? And I think a big key is, do you provide value to the listener? Too many people tell stories and forget who's listening to it or who isn't listening to it. And I think everything has to be um, a perspective of context and how people can relate to it. So, Beverly, I know you tell great stories about true stories. So, what could you share with us?
Yes, a lot of story. um, I love what you said, Diane, about something was,
Mhm.
something
That's
is,
right.
happened. I
Mhm.
jumped right to something is. And the reason for that is that's how we think.
Mhm.
We forget that it's only a happening. And when you put it in your terms, something was, something happened, something is, it minimizes the is. And when we carry that is around, we make it real. And what I see every single day is I break up the story, if you will, because it is not true. It's just something that happened. But if you carry that is around, you believe it and you follow that story. And that story can take you into very dark places. It can also take you into some amazing places. Like when you're thinking of people like Steve Jobs, who had this story that he was going to die young. He always felt that for many, many reasons. We won't go into that, but the bottom line is it's a feeling. How did you know? Didn't know. But what happens here is if you have that story that I'm not going to live long, that I come from a family of very short livers, I have to do it all today. And then you push yourself. And there are so many people that are pushing themselves because of that story that you tell yourself. But it's just as Diane said, it's not an is. It only is what it is in your head. It's just a happening. So you have to make your story work for you. And if your story is working for you, terrific. But if you keep on telling yourself negative stories and you start seeing where it came from, it's just a happening. I always spill my juice. When I was 3 years old, I remember spilling juice. And to this day, I spill water when I go up, all these kind of stories until I am a slob. And that carries in, why can't I pick up the laundry? Why? Because I'm a slob, right? All these stories, by the way, that's not me. Okay, that's not me. But what it is the story. And perhaps, there was a label along with that. Well, that person had ADD or ADHD. Labels are put on you very early. And then you have a reason to carry that story on rather than saying, I've been labeled. It doesn't really matter. This is who I am. I can take control of that and I can actually rewrite that story. And you know what? You can. You absolutely can. It's mental attitude and it's the feeling that you can do it. Like Steve Jobs' story, what it did was it motivated him to do more. It motivated him not to care. It motivated him to go into a direction with a passion that he had and did not care because the story was everything was on a very short lifeline. So think of your story also, because we all have one. And I encourage you to go back into your mind really truly and ask yourself, is it really real? Or is it an is? Is it a fact? Or can you just let that go? And what did you learn from it? And can you move on? Diane.
I'd like to braid together what you've been saying, Beverly, and something that Don said earlier about relevance and context. So, yes, a story in its simplest form is something happened, something was, something happened, something is. And that can be a large story, like a Steve Jobs story, or it can be a small story. And when we are in a position to share a story with listeners, and this is where Don's comment about context comes in. We keep hearing out there in the ether world is that our stories don't count, that we have to tell a story that matters to the audience. Well, yeah, but here's the thing that people who don't know about story forget. It's that when we select a story to tell to clients or to audience, what we are considering is the relevance in terms of the context. Do I want to offer a provocative story, an uplifting story, a motivational story, a sad story, a grief, loss to redemption story? It's on that basis, with those universal truths, truth with a capital T, that we are then relating to our listeners. So when I share a story as you are doing now, Beverly, as Don probably will do, we are pulling back in the memory bank of experience and life and saying, where is there a story in my life that carries a universal truth or truths that I want to communicate to the listeners? And in story world, it's listeners, but it's also, okay, audience and clients and whatever. What are the truths that want to be communicated at this time? And once we're focused on that, then the story that we're taking from our life will fall into the context that is understandable and relatable in our listeners. Because I don't know my listeners, but I do know humans, and I know the ways in which story and humans connect with each other. And that is by taking the content of a story, the facts, putting it together with the context, the situation in which those facts happened, and then relating it in a way that is not just understandable to the listener in their brains, but can be felt on an emotional level by the listeners. And the reason for that is because in our DNA, in our memories, each of us has had the experience of grief to loss to redemption, of achievement, of accomplishment, of failure to becoming more. That is the way in which we all connect with each other. And so by taking the Steve Jobs story, for example, Beverly, you're saying here is someone who knew something about his life and was sharing it in a way that we could understand. We understand urgency. We understand time is passing. We understand I want to do something useful with my life. We get that. And so that can be a motivational, inspirational story. So when you said earlier that you go back and look at your life, into the something was and something happened, when I work with my clients, one of the one of the things that makes me different is by saying, let's do an archaeological dig on your life. Let's go back to when you were 5 and 7 and your values were being formed. What did you enjoy doing? What is in that past civilization that you might have forgotten that we can bring forward into the story so that you can go, wow, I didn't know I had that when all along you did. And that's why I mentioned the values earlier. When we look at our stories and we look at the values in our life, then we can begin to match up the something was, the something happened with the something is. Now it all makes sense to us. Oh,
And
one last thing.
that's very powerful, Diane, and you explain it so well. What it reminds me of is not only do you tell a story, but you touch with a story,
Yeah.
and how do people connect with that story? I know when I tell stories here about my grandmother or someone else, in an instant, everybody's thinking of their grandmother in one way or
Exactly.
another, right? Because you brought attention to it, and everybody goes back into their mental filing cabinet. And it's really great when the stories you remember are the happiest stories. And you wonder, why did someone who lived in the same house, experienced the same people, always remember things that you don't care about, maybe that are negative or challenging, and you tend to always find the happy occasions, the family get-togethers. And stories bring you back into the story. Sometimes you can close your eyes and look at the dinner
Mhm.
table 20 years ago or a special event. And I think that's what's so cool about stories. It can take you out of your present reality, which may be challenging, and replace it with a happier reality. And I think when you have as many positive stories, you encourage people to hear them. How many times did you ever feel good and someone told the story and brought you down? And you're like, I don't want to hear from that storyteller again, to a point. So, it's really cool. Let me share a little bit of all these wonderful people who seem to show up all at the same time today. We've got, let me see, we've got Carrie, who is known when lemons catch a cold, they turn to lemonade. Uh, Here's Gary Marcus Judge, new person I'm not familiar with, but more than happy to see Gary join. He's actually from Verona, Italy,
Oh, lovely.
which I'm sure has a story to it. We've got Dennis, agree, great storytelling. Let me just put it on the board. Agree, good storytellers bring your glory and less sorry. Jason Gerardo's here. Good morning, all. Let me see if we have some more. I believe we do. Here we go with Dennis again. Agree, break it up will help wake up and motivate us. And here's my good friend and colleague to both me and Beverly and our cohort group that meets every other Thursday, meeting this Thursday. Carl says, happy to be an audience.
Right.
Carl's just the greatest. I do every other Wednesday with Carl and fills in on Mondays. Carl started the funding show of his own a few months ago and has a daily newsletter. In addition, August 1st, Carl's launching his second show on Thursday mornings, an hour before
Awesome.
and he's really bringing it into his fundraising activities, providing everybody a LinkedIn Live opportunity to share their story. And I think this is just a great medium for storytellers because you can talk to so many people in a most time efficient way and talking to like relevant, aligned people in that way, which is also so important. So if you don't know Carl, you definitely have to reach out,
Yes.
make a connection with him.
Yes.
Just a quality person. He's building a dinosaur park in Texas. He's in community development in Baltimore. He's working on window insulation products. So a man of all trades, a jack of all trades. So thank you, Carl. He's just infectious with his goodness and positivity.
For sure.
Dennis is here, been here since the show started, I believe, 49 years in the heating and air conditioning business here in Colorado. Agree, we do need to learn from our mistakes, but we have to go further and learn from others' mistakes too, because we won't live long enough to make them all, for sure. Good point, Dennis. Always happy to have you. And I think that's part of having a storytelling circle, in a sense, is people go up every day to hear everybody's news, everybody's opportunities. And, it's a lot easier to be part of something than to go it alone. And it's kind of hard to tell a story when no one's in front of you. So with that said, let me turn it back to Beverly and
Sure.
see what we have there. Okay.
Well, as I was thinking with what the two of you were saying, the reason I've gone into coaching women over 50 is because of the stories I've heard from women, and as well as men, of course, but that women carry the load in so many different ways that I have decided that I would do coaching for women over 50 because of the stories, because of the burdens, because of the loads that they've been carrying along the way, and created a podcast, Aging with Purpose and Passion, which is only about story, where there is that hero's journey that you've been through something and you've come through it. And that empowers others, because when we are listening to other people's stories, you can say, that's me. I can relate. Stories help us relate to others. Otherwise, we're in our own heads and we feel that we're living alone. And as soon as you meet people and you know more about them, you realize no matter what they've accomplished, no matter what they have done in their lives, no matter what you look at and admire, they're like you. And they have their hopes and their dreams and their feelings and their losses, just like you. So the more you get to know who you're talking to, the more you can relate to that person. And so you also shouldn't fear to tell your story, because when I empower others, although they believe that I'm doing all the work, all I'm doing is allowing them to break through their stories because they have no limitations. It's the story that keeps you limited. It's the story you tell to yourself that I really can't move through this, that it's too much for me. And so when you're hiring a coach or when you're hiring anybody or talking to friends, relate to them through a story and they'll get it. If you start telling people what to do, where to go, being an authority, then they will go back. But if you start explaining, well, this has really worked for me, perhaps it'll work for you. In your story, people get it. It takes a little more time, but we have all the time for people that should be important to us. And this is why I'm saying when you're talking to children or you're talking to good friends, listening, which is part of the story too, to be a good listener and not just to add your experiences or to be a good talker. One thing is completely different. Listening to talk, or listening to actually hear the other person. What is that person saying? And then add value, should you add, or just listen. So stories make you think. Stories make you feel. Stories bring out your humanity. And in advertising, in marketing, they really play on that. And we could talk about that because a lot of very creative stuff is done through stories in marketing and advertising. And stories are everywhere. But we have to understand our own story. And if it's a negative story, make it a was, okay, and let it go. Or make it what it wasn't a was, the was in the middle. Make it done. That's how I want to look at it. It's over. Just a thought. Because really, that's all it is. And you can magnify those thoughts and push you harder and harder into a very negative place or give you a direction in your life where you really don't want to go. Your stories lead you there. You can break it up and change the story, rewrite the book, and definitely rewrite the chapter.
Excellent
Diane.
points, Beverly. Diane, love to hear your thoughts.
When I teach story, a question that I always ask is, what's the most important skill a storyteller has? And you get all kinds of answers about platform skills and delivery and tone of voice and that such. But the most important skill a storyteller has is to listen, which sounds paradoxical. But you are listening for the reactions of your listeners. You're watching them as they follow the story with you, kind of like you're dropping crumbs in the forest and they're following behind you and picking up those crumbs and they join you. And then you walk on and drop some more crumbs and they pick them up. And so watching your listeners as you're telling the story is key to knowing, are they getting it? Are they with me? Are they understanding where I am? Is there something that I've missed or dropped? And so if you ever take a class from me, you'll win a prize because you'll know the answer. Listening is the most important skill. And as we listen the story out of people, so 30 years ago when I started in story, one of my very first story mentors said, you are a story doula because you're midwifing the stories out of people. And that's what Beverly was also talking about, that we listen the stories out of people. My mentor said, never always remember this lesson, that people know exactly the story they want to tell. but they just need someone to listen it out of them. And that is a truth that has stayed with me for 30 years because we don't get listened to. We don't have the opportunity to be heard. And so by as in Beverly's work as she was talking, listening that story out of the client is 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 profound. Is profound because you've got the honor and the respect in the person who's telling you the story, and you are drawing that out much like a midwife does with a baby and says, here's this is what you are producing. This is what you are creating. This is what has been inside of you all along. So our job, my job as a guide, is just that, kind of like the baby catcher. And I think that is so important because it puts the control in the place where it belongs, in the lap of the storyteller. There's two other things that come to mind. I love telling Jewish stories in part because the maternal side of my family, way back in Poland, is Jewish. And the Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer used to tell his people, he was the founder of the Hasidic line of Judaism. He used to say, when you hear a story, regardless of whether you're sitting in a small group or a big group, you're to raise your eyes to your God and ask, why are you telling this story to me at this time? And the reason that that is so important to me is because I believe that stories are organic, that they come alive. And I imagine to our listeners, they've been in a place where they want to express themselves in some way, and unbidden, a story comes that they hadn't thought about for time. And that's because stories show up when and where they're supposed to. Stories will follow us home, they will sleep in our beds, they will sit at our tables. They're very, very magical. And one of the difficulties I find with business storytelling is the way in which story has been co opted and conscripted to serve a purpose, and that is to sell. When in fact, as Beverly and Don were talking earlier, the role of story is to connect us, is to bring us together and remind us that we are, we enter our, and that's the beauty of story. So the last thing I'll say is, with world peace being maybe within our grasp, I think the way to encourage it is everybody has block parties. We all have block parties in our neighborhoods, and everybody brings a dish that comes from their childhood that they love. And you come to the block party and you bring your dish of food to share, and you bring with that food the story of why that dish is important to you, why it's wonderful, why you remember it. And when you're sharing food and stories, as Beverly was saying earlier, then you get to remember what it's like to be connected as human to human. That's the way I look at story.
Well, that's terrific. It sure is inspiring and inspirational. I think that's the same thing as inspiring. Um, and to go to in business, like Beverly had alluded to, I had a saying: "Facts tell, stories sell." Right? Everybody, no one wants to hear the specifications in this. They want to know the why, the how come, that element to it. And it gives you a better bond. Another way I look at it is your life is a continuing story, right? Starts with the first page and ends with the last page. And everything in between could be a paragraph, could be a page, could be a chapter, but you move through it, or you take it along with you in a sense, but it continues and it can change. So what was a story with maybe not the best ending, with hindsight, looking back, one can see the values and the benefits that might have been there that you didn't fully appreciate at the time. So, I think because if it's an ever lasting, ever changing, possibly situation, but it's only a page, it's only a paragraph. It's not your whole story. And too many people get stuck on a page or a chapter or a situation, and it starts to cloud the rest of their stories or take precedence. With that, I want to recognize Christine. Christine is a friend of the show. She's just
Hi,
an amazing
Christine.
lady who has so many stories. I'm so impressed. She just got her MBA. She manages a family. She has a career, and she's always doing wonderful things. So thank you, Christine. Her comment is getting to really know the other person is why it's good to research people and companies before you get in front of a client to position your product. And, it's always better to get some vowels before you try to solve the puzzle. So, is asking questions can give you some context as to people's interest or feelings towards things. And it's better to follow their lead than to just open up a whole new chapter for them. And the other part is, I think we all have said this, is listening is instrumental to the storytelling. Someone's talking, someone's listening. When the person you're talking to stops listening, you stop talking, right? Or you change your subject to something else. With that said, Dennis is here. We others are just like us, and we like ourselves better when we take the time to listen. And why not give the steering wheel to somebody else and let them drive for a while? And it shows respect when you have an interest in what other people are saying, and you encourage them to talk because so many people get stifled. They take the wrong clues and they say, well, it's not relevant. I'm not relevant. It's not important. And it just starts to spiral the other way. Dennis says, Carl's here. Carl says, a failure makes for a good story as a learning moment. Actually, I have a friend in Bangkok who has done a live stream podcast, has over, I think, 900 episodes now.
Oh.
And only does one once a week. So you can tell how many years he's been doing it. And his whole thing is my worst investment ever. That's the story. That's the program. And you come on and you tell whatever was the worst thing you did as far as, it doesn't have to be money. It could be a time investment. But it's just curious how so many people are so attached to things that nobody else would have thought of. I would have never come up with a show, my worst investment. And a lot of people would say, well, it's pretty depressing. No, it's pretty uplifting because every bad investment usually came a learning situation that they went on and adjusted things based on the worst to become the best. And I think resiliency is so important. Perseverance is so important. How do you move through something? Everybody knows the what, they don't always know the why, and I think that's what's so important is what's underneath, what's yet to be talked about or heard. Dennis comes back with agree, great block party share and don't block you out. And look who's here, our good friend and cohort.
Harvey.
Harvey is just an amazing individual. I can't promote Harvey enough. I'm glad whenever Harvey's here, but I always promote Harvey when he's not here. And I know he's his story came on about exactly a year ago in the audience. Didn't take long to be a guest host. Within 4 months, started the franchise show on Tuesdays that follows this show. And it became the #1 franchise event on LinkedIn in a short period of time. Just a few months ago, he launched his second show, The Franchise Brand Story, which is allowing franchisors to tell their story as far as how they got started, building brand awareness and recognition. And Harvey is also part of our cohort group that meets every other Thursday with us. And it's so great because it brings storytelling to the table, which is, what'd you learn this week? Who'd you have on? What could we do together? It's really the collaboration that comes out of everybody's individual efforts when they come together, and it's free flowing. This show is unscripted. So you can go anywhere you want whenever you think of something new. Carrie says, hello, Harvey. Carrie's our welcome wagon for all of our guest hosts. Carrie's just a wonderful gentleman. Beverly laughs And when Beverly laughs, everybody laughs. Such a smile. So Beverly, what?
Thank you. Um, oh, I'm just listening and enjoying everyone's stories. And that's the thing with stories. We can relate to each other through stories. And there's a humanity in it. And we can share stories. And that's what it's all about. And I'm going to go back to marketing as well because it's used all the time in the story. And some of the marketing is extremely creative because it's a little mini film. And it's a little mini film story to get you, of course, to buy. And stories, whether it's good, whether it's bad, no judgment here, but they can actually change the paradigm. And an interesting little story, which is a commercial, was, and it keeps on playing on TV, where how many people love to do laundry? Well, you know, in a laundry commercial, you're always selling soap. Well, now what they seem to be doing is selling odor. And it's like, oh, I'm fresh. I can be fresh for a week. And what they're selling through the story is you don't have to do your laundry. And I'm saying to myself, wow, look at that. Now, you can say that's creative marketer, but what are they doing? They're selling a story that is in a lot of people's heads that is, I don't like to do laundry, but I certainly don't like the smell, right? So they created this brand, which isn't really necessary. And that's what they do. Now, when you're looking at stories logically, you can start to say, wow, how creative is that? And what you're also doing is you're saying, well, I'm not going to buy that product. So what you're doing is being critical, not just falling into the story. Because what they're banking on is that you do fall into the story. And so stories can lead you in many different directions, some positive, some negative, but you should be thinking, much like as you're reading a story or whatever it is, there's a bias here. There's a reason someone's telling the story, and it has a conclusion in the end, but you should always judge where you're going in the story because guess what? It's your story, actually. When somebody has told it, you own it. And what I love so much about going back to the women that I interview, Diane was one of them. Go into her episode. One of the stories that people are telling about themselves is going through illnesses, and cancer is one of them. And how many women have gone through really bad cancer treatments and come out the other side. And when they're telling the story in Aging with Purpose and Passion, what happens is if you're going through that struggle, you can see promise, you can see hope. And that's what these heroes' journeys are really about. And so stories can be for really good, positive things. It can also skew you in another way. It can make you literally, because if you see it so many times, literally brain rewiring is going to be saying, hey, it's not so bad. And it starts out being bad, but in the end, it's like, oh, it's not so bad. Depending on how often you're going to be seeing something like this, you can start to feel that you're not part of the story unless, for instance, you buy a specific product, unless you are not one of the crowd. And so, yes, we have stories everywhere, and you do have to be aware of them because with social media, my goodness, it's out there. And so you have to be able to be critical, be judgmental. Don't just go with the crowd saying, hey, this is not for me, but it's a great story, maybe for someone else. Don't knock it, but understand that you can be very subjected and drawn into something that you really don't want. And that's why I do love your friend's podcast because everyone has failures. Dawn. And so that is actually, it's motivating. It's like, oh, it's like the fish that got away, that one. Okay, I have a bigger story to tell. And so it's all about story. It brings us together. It's collective. And as Diane was saying, we're all in it together. And the elders, the younger ones, everyone has a story, and it connects us all. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
It absolutely is.
Diane.
Let me just share real quick before I turn it over to Diane that Harvey says stories are so important. How you tell the story, remember the props. Me and Harvey wear hats. I never wear a hat before the show or after the show. Unless I go outside.
Glasses.
Glasses. I just want to say that Harvey Show follows this show. If you're interested in learning more about Harvey and his story, please go to his profile. All of our shows, if you go to our profile when it begins, you can engage it. So you don't need links or anything like that. And moving back to Diane, what's your new thoughts on storytelling?
How much time have you got? A couple of things. When you mentioned earlier, Dawn, resistance, I think you said, no, resilience and perseverance. You mentioned that in passing, and it was a great example of what we call the universal truths, the truths with a capital T, so that when
Mhm.
you're telling a story, as Beverly suggested, around surviving a cancer struggle, we somehow seem to gravitate, we as humans gravitate to the pull yourself up by the bootstrap story. What we want to know as listeners, this is why we follow, stories about The Hobbit and Star Trek and we want to know what's happening to the hero. How are they going to get out of
Mhm.
the situation? And so if we're writing stories that we're going to tell with ourselves or someone else as a character, that comes into play. What does the character want? What do they desire? And what do they have to do to get what they want? And what choices do they have to make to get what they want? And what are the consequences attached to those choices? So, using Beverly's example of a woman struggling with cancer, what she wants is full health. That's what she wants. And what are the choices in front of her to gain that? And what are the consequences of those choices? And what happens when she acts those out? Because she can't have all the choices, but she's got to make a choice. And that choice is a consequence. And what happens next? Does she get what she wanted? Did she not get what she wanted? Because the end of every story is always the beginning of the next story. So when we're telling the stories about resilience and perseverance, that's what's coming into play. What kind of situation was that character in? To get to where they wanted to go, what did they have to do? What did they have to choose? In the stories that you're giving us, Dawn, about your friend in the bad investment, what did that person want when they invested? What choices did they make? What were the consequences of those choices? And then what happened next? So it's those elements of the story, because we've been talking around story, but we're talking now about the structure of the story. Those are some of the elements that we can consider bringing in. And when we're telling some of the difficult stories, so I've told a story about incest. I've told a story about getting lost on the Camino. I've told a story about losing my marriage, my law firm position, and my mother, all in the space of 9 months. These are what I call difficult stories, but they give voice to something that needs to be heard. And as we choose to tell a difficult story, one of the things that I've found helpful is being able to do the work around that story. Some people would go and sit with Beverly. Some people would come and sit with me. Some women would sit with either one of us to get that story listened out so that it can be shaped and held in such a way that it can be then delivered to the listeners as a gift. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, the role of story is a gift. It's a gift to the listener. And if we're going to bring a difficult story into the audience for the reasons that it belongs there, then our job is to make sure that we've done the work on our story so that we can deliver that story as the gift it's supposed to be, of loss to redemption, for example. And more importantly, the listeners don't feel like they have to reach out and grab us. Oh my God, she's going to fall apart. I gave the eulogy at my mother's funeral. And storytellers will lose. They'll lose their place in their story. They will show emotion. And that's okay, but we don't want to fall apart when we're doing it. So here's a tip. If you're telling a difficult story and you get to that place in the story where you know you're going to shed some tears, it's okay to shed a tear. Stop for a moment, take in a deep breath, and repeat the words that you just said. And that'll put you back on track. You will tell the story just fine, but your listeners will know that that story matters to you, that there's an emotion to that story. And again, that's what we connect to, is the memories and the emotions and the feelings, because at the end of the day, that's all we are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think it has so much importance and value. You know, I've learned that there is no outcomes, everything's a continuum, right? And, you know, where you start isn't always where you finish, where you are isn't always where you stay. And the other thing is, they always say a smart person is someone learns from their stories or mistakes, but a real smart person learns from somebody else's. And one way to give yourself more value is to share the lessons you've had to pay a heavy price for, that you can allow somebody else to get that same insight without going through that same experience. The other thing, every time you say something, you're listening to it as soon as it comes out of your mouth too. And it reinforces and validates that story. The more you tell it, the more you hear it, the more you share it. Plus, you get the benefit of going from someone listening to your story to someone giving you feedback to your story, right? And someone will say, well, you were so brave, you were so strong, you were so this. And pretty soon you think, you're right. I didn't think of that until you told me that. And now maybe that made it a little bit better. And I think that's the key, is get a little bit better with every situation, with every encounter, with every conversation. If you go back before the internet and before the printing press, things were passed on by people around the circle telling their story about their ancestors or about this and that, and it carried forward, right? And everything you're sharing has a life of its own when it's released. And too many people have a wonderful voice, but don't have a method or a vehicle to leverage it, you know? And when you get your own microphone and you can turn it on anytime and invite anybody you want to hear you, that is power. You know, it's bottling it up or making like it doesn't exist, getting into denial, you know, that really hurts people, because you know what? Everybody's got a story. And it might be a different story, but everybody goes through loss. Everybody goes through gain, right? And how does the good balance some of the not so good? And you know, the other thing is, you can add something to the story. I know when I've lost dear family members, I would always say, how would they want me to feel right now? How would they want me to deal with it? And in almost all cases, they wouldn't want me to be sad. They wouldn't want me to forget about what I was doing or where I was going and get caught up in it. So in a way, there's an obligation to the people who came before you to carry forward, you know, because they invested so much and cared so much. And I think it does take somebody like Beverly or yourself to kind of sort it out for people, because people know what it is, but some people don't know how to respond to it, don't know how to stay with it, because At the end of the day, it is what it is. It's what do you want to add to it for as long as you want to add to it, right? You break a glass, it's not going to be unbroken tomorrow. And you could talk about how it cost so much, where it came from, but that's not going to change anything. At the same time, there's no sense speeding through something or not taking it seriously. But I've always looked at failure as feedback. Not as, either you earn or you learn, but you never lose. Life is a blessing in itself. And if you don't experience some of the challenging things, you're never going to appreciate some of the successful things. Dennis says, we are all listening. Thanks for the gift. Beverly, these shows go so quickly. And I think it's so sincere and heartfelt and authentic that's the cause or the reason for it. What's your thoughts at this point?
Oh, so many. What Diane said is yes, you can heal through story. You can heal when you tell your story, but often we don't want to tell our story. And so here's another tip. You do not have to, but you do have to get it out. And one way of doing it is journaling. And you don't have to journal in a fancy leather journal. No, as a matter of fact, I always suggest scrap paper. And I always suggest just write what you feel. It does not have to be the great American novel. No, and it won't be. But when you're getting out your feelings and you're journaling with all your heart and you're scratching it out and you're starting over or whatever it is, you're liberating yourself through that journey, through that story. And so when you do that, you're doing it for yourself. And that's what a story should really be. If you're talking to others, as Diane was saying, there's often a purpose for that. There is a story that you are telling to the listener, but you can be revealing a story and no one is listening except you. And that's the message to self. That's the message that says, I have to relieve this pressure. And in that, just in telling your story and talking about your story and putting everything you have, your heart and your soul into it, you're releasing the good, the bad, the ugly, and you're coming to terms with really where you are today. It always lands back to where you are today. And that really is your hero's journey. You've just gone through so much garbage to come to exactly where you are. And so it's very cathartic. If you're writing in a journal or not a journal, I prefer not a journal because then you can't have fun with it and really get into it. And you try when you have a nice journal to keep it nice. You don't want it nice because everything, all the stories in your head are messy. When you want to really write a story, then that's where the craft and the art of story writing and storytelling is about. But this isn't craft. This isn't art. This is gut. This is raw. This is real. This is you. And it's all in your story. And you have to cherish that because it's all about you. All about you guys. Get it out.
That is wonderful advice, Beverly. And we're coming up with about a minute and a half to go. So I'll swing it over to Diane for final thoughts and how you felt about the storytelling show we had today.
5 thumbs up. I love Beverly's suggestion. I'm big into getting out on the driveway with sidewalk chalks. The kids in my neighborhood think I'm absolutely nuts. What's that old lady doing on her knees with a sidewalk chalk? Making pictures. And so I agree with that. You get down on your hands and knees with big pieces of paper, get it out there. Here's what I would say. Our lives are compost. Everything that's
Mhm.
happened to us is like bread crusts and coffee grounds and banana peels and eggshells. And for those of us who compost, you put it in a big old bucket somewhere and it turns into something that the worms really like, and you put it out on your garden and it fertilizes and makes everything grow. And I think if we take a look at our lives and say, that's it, my life is compost. And while it doesn't look so pretty going in, all those eggshells and coffee grounds and all that stuff, what it ends up being is something that fertilizes the gardens of our life. And if we can keep it in perspective like that, I think we're all just going to be growing some really beautiful flowers.
That's so
So
nice.
thank you. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody on the chat. It's been grand to share the mic with you.
Well, it's been a true
You
blessing to
too.
have you today, and look forward to having you back. Beverly, your final thoughts.
My final thoughts. First of all, I love what you said, Diane. I really do. It's perfect. We're all just coffee grounds. And on that note, my final tip is to remember that. Okay, it's just a story and you can change it. And it really doesn't matter. Don't carry it. You can rewrite it. And if you're looking for motivational stories, Aging with Purpose and Passion, you'll find women going through their journey, their struggle, and they always give tips as to how they have gotten out of it. And so we can all relate because we're all in it together. And you can also contact me at any time to tell your story. Within 15 minutes, there's a lot you can say, believe me, to cut to the chase. And then after that, yes, I will put the details on for you so you could move forward in your journey and you're not stuck. Because the story that you tell yourself can keep you stuck or it can liberate you. So it's your choice. And thank you all for being here. Thank you all for listening. And thank you, Dawn, for every Tuesday. You light up my life on 11 o'clock Eastern.
Well, the same goes. I can't wait for Tuesday with Beverly because I know how I feel after the show from where I felt before the show, and I'm always pretty feeling good before the show. And I think collectively, we told a story today too that we shared in the telling of the story. And there's a saying that says, "No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care." And I know through what Diane and Beverly and myself were sharing today was really loving intentions, wanting to help people heal themselves in a way, and know there is hope, know there is opportunity. As long as you have another day, you have an opportunity to enjoy it, to appreciate what you've had. Going through a terrible experience, the benefit of it is you went through it and you're still here, right? It's hard going into it because it seems so daunting and everything else, but life does go on if you allow it to go on, and it's all perspective. So with that, beautiful audience, very strong audience today, great comments, a lot of people listening and watching, and that's what makes storytelling so important, is having people really appreciate the story and appreciate you for telling it. So there's extra reward there. So come back tomorrow, 23 hours from now. We have Jason Girardo and Dave Snell. And then Thursday, we have Kelly Stanecki, and she's been with me every Thursday now since January 19th of last year. So you can imagine how many shows we've done. And she's got her own show, The Awesome Journey with Christy Howard, which is today at 1:11 p.m. I'm always promoting. And with that, thank you all very much. Appreciate